Okay. We are live now. And I am posting the link right now on, I'm gonna send the link to everybody on the chat. So here's the YouTube link for everyone. Okay. All right, everybody ready to get started? We're all good?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Washington?
I'm good. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, I can.
Good. Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome. And I'm going to, I'll keep the, so in on YouTube, anybody who has the link, we may have questions that come through YouTube. And so I'll monitor that. And if anybody asks a question, I'll go ahead and bring that to the floor as well. So Dr. Washington, thank you for blessing our class. As we mentioned, this is the Legacy of Booker T. Washington class, Humanities 200 at Tuskegee University. And we've been really honored over the last two sessions to have some of the most scholarly minds that know anything about Booker T. Washington, from Dr. Tyreen Wright on Friday to now yourself as as not only just a scholar of Booker T. Washington, but also his great grandson. So we're honored that you are able to join us and share your thoughts. So you mentioned that you have about 30 minutes and then you'll have to go. So I'm going to quickly just jump in and allow you to have the floor.
Thank you. I want to say I really am honored to be in such august presence. I appreciate the opportunity to participate today. I want to again thank Dr. Tyreen Wright for such a wonderful presentation on Friday. And I have ordered the book, but I also watched a YouTube video where I was very impressed with the explanation that you gave about the, as you call it, the evolution or development of the consciousness of Booker T. Washington. And surely that is a fact of history. And also I want to thank your students, Professor Daniel, for the wonderful presentations that they gave last Friday. I was very impressed with their scholarship and their professional approach to making presentations. And I can assure them that that will stand them in very good stead as they go forward into the world outside of the campus. So with that said, I want to begin by, first of all, just very briefly telling your audience, since this is being broadcast on YouTube, who I am. My name, when I was actually born on the Tuskegee Army Airfield at the hospital there during World War II, is the name of my father, who was one of the first Black pilots to be commissioned during that time in the program that was called the Tuskegee Experiment. Then we referred to them as the Tuskegee Airmen. His name was Marshall Schuyler Cabinis. He had 3 years prior to enlisting in the cadet pilot training program at Tuskegee, graduated from Morehouse College. He was the student body president his senior year. During his junior and senior years, he had been the bossless of the Psi chapter of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. And he was one of the first Black insurance agents in the state of Alabama. He and his fraternity brother named John Drew actually were commissioned to go to Tuskegee to set up a branch of the Alexander Insurance Company. Alexander was a man who was very well known back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and even into the 70s down in Atlanta. So my father had a future going for him, but the war interrupted that, and he decided to go into the Army and become an officer pilot, and I'm named after him. So my legal name is Marshall Schuyler Cavendish Jr. And I use the name Washington because that's my mother's name. My mother was one of the granddaughters of Booker T. Washington by his second son, Ernest Davidson Washington. She was the second of four daughters that he had. I grew up in the home across the campus that no longer exists, that he had built, as I mentioned on Friday, as a wedding present for his son and my grandmother when they got married. She was from Washington, D.C. So I had a very, very special kind of upbringing, being brought up in the home that he visited many times. And my grandmother was a young woman, 20 years old or so, when she married my grandfather. And so she was very, very impressed by him. In fact, to be honest with you, I think she was in love with him, to be frank. But of course, that's as far as it went. It was just a feeling that she had because she was in the presence of such an august person that took really good care of his family, including her by building her a home. So I was surrounded as a child, not only by that house, but by the campus of Tuskegee. Growing up on the campus, I went to college there, but even as a grade school and high school student, I attended lectures and other events on the campus. And so my connection with Tuskegee goes farther back than just the years I spent there as a student. And the point that I'm going to make now, before I get into my actual, what I want to talk about, is that I was at Tuskegee when it was still a trade school slant academic college. And even though when I went there, everyone did not have to take a trade, there was a time when everyone did, even those that were going to go out into the districts in Macon County and other places in Alabama to teach the rudiments, the reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography, et cetera, et cetera. But in the beginning, everyone had to take a trade. And there was a reason for that, because Booker T. Washington, as I'll mention in my future part of my talk, he wanted his students, since they were going to be given the opportunity to teach in schools that were being erected. And there's a whole nother story about how he got Julius Rosenwald, a rich financier, a president at one time of Sears, Roebuck and Company, to help to finance the building of over 5,000 schools in the South. But he wanted the people to build schools themselves, and he wanted those teachers to help show them how to do that, in addition to working as teachers in the classroom. So that's my introduction. Now I'm going to get into discussing something from my book. This is a book, I hope you can see the title, Booker T. Washington for a New America. The book was actually written in 2015 and originally published. I'm a publisher, so I self-published the book, and I published books for myself and others. And one of the things that I've done to give back to the community is I do all of this for free. Anyone who has a story they want to tell, if they come to me and I see that they really want to roll up their sleeves and take time to help me go through the dynamics of publishing a book, because it's not an overnight thing, then I won't charge them for it. So I published this book in 2015 under the title of Booker T. Washington and the Black Revolution. But I realized after 4 years of promoting this book, and I go all around the country doing book signings and promotions, that many of the people that I talk to, the younger people, and even some of the people that are a little bit younger than me, I'm not going to try to sound like I'm an old man, but I'll be 77 on my next birthday this year. But the fact is that many people don't relate to the Black Revolution. But so I'm going to begin with talking about that. Booker T. Washington, and I'm actually reading parts of my book as I speak. So if you see me looking over to the left, that's where my book stand is. Booker T. Washington a name that evokes mixed feelings. Almost all of the white people with whom I have spoken in my lifetime, and remember, I said I'm over 70 years old, praise the name of Booker T. Washington. Almost all of the white people that I have met in my lifetime praise the name of Booker T. Washington. In fact, the first book that I actually sold was sold to a white man who was a member of an organization called the International Lions Club that I belonged to. And at one of our meetings, I took the book and I was showing it around. And at that time, I was the only African-American in the group of about 20 people. And this white gentleman said, I need to get that. But these white people sincerely believed that my great-grandfather, Booker T. Washington, was the greatest African-American that ever lived. On the other hand, most Negroes or African Americans or Americans of African slave ancestry either do not know who Booker T. Washington was or do not think very highly of him. This is what I have found out. And I have found that there are graduates of Tuskegee University, the school that he founded, and he didn't do it alone. He actually was a co-founder with several other people. But I have found that there are graduates of Tuskegee that do not even have any idea about the foundation of character building and intellectual, moral, economic, and social development upon which their illustrious alma mater was built over 138 years ago. And sadly, some of those that do know something about Booker T. Washington are ashamed that he was the founder of the school that gave them their college and often graduate education. And that's a fact. Why is this? And what, if anything, is Booker T. Washington's relationship to the Black Revolution, as we called it? Well, let's say this. I am a product of the Black Revolution. I was born in 1943, and I explained that I was born the son of an Army lieutenant. He had been commissioned by that time. And I attended Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, during the beginning of the Black Revolution. I transferred from Tuskegee after my sophomore year at Tuskegee. I was an English major there. And I transferred to the University of California at Berkeley. I'd previously been admitted to Berkeley and spent a semester there before leaving Berkeley and going into the U.S. Army, which was a very fortuitous move that I made because I didn't have to wait to get drafted to go to Vietnam as some of my friends did. But I went back to Tuskegee after finishing 3 years on active duty in the Army. Spent my freshman and sophomore years there. I was president of the sophomore class my sophomore year there. And then I returned back to Berkeley as a junior. And I was on the campus of Berkeley at the height of the Black Revolution, which I will say was 1969. And it was on the campus of Tuskegee University, moving back to Tuskegee from the Berkeley picture, 3 weeks before his brutal assassination in New York, that I encountered a prominent leader of the Black Revolution, Malcolm X. He was invited by the Student Government Association, which was heavily influenced by SNCC, that admired Malcolm. And he was invited there since he was going to be in the general area. He had gone to Selma. Many of you may have seen YouTube clips about him in Selma. And at the time, he wanted to actually meet Martin Luther King, who was in prison at that time, serving a short stint in prison. But he did meet Mrs. Coretta King. But he wanted to let the civil rights leaders know that he had moved away from the separatist ideology of his mentor, Elijah Muhammad, and he wanted to coalesce and join the larger movement. So he came to Tuskegee while he was in the area, and his presence there in the Logan Hall gym, which is where we had all of the events like that during those days, changed my whole life. I became a Black nationalist. I became a Black militant. I later joined the Black Nation of Islam. I'm not a member of that group now, but I was for 6 years. But it was on that campus that Malcolm inspired not just me, but many of us. It was his declaration of war against white supremacy, freedom by any means necessary, the ballot or the bullet, the ballot or the bullet, that ignited the spark, that lit the fire of Black rebellion and pushed the long smoldering Black resistance to white oppression into full-scale revolution. So when I left Tuskegee during the summer of 1966, the embers of revolution there at Tuskegee had already begun to glow. The embers had been there, and I can go into some of the history of the civil rights movement that predated Martin Luther King. In fact, I met Martin Luther King during the civil rights movement right after he had been successful or was in the process of being successful in Montgomery with the boycott there. The city council of Tuskegee and the white city fathers, seeing the power and the determination of the college community, particularly the college community, but there were also people from the nearby Veterans Administration that were highly educated. And they knew that in spite of the very, very unfair reading requirement and remembering part of the Constitution requirement that was imposed just on the Black candidates for registration, that they could pass it. And some of them had passed it several times and still were not registered to vote. And so as this temper of resistance to this white oppression began to get stronger, the white people decided to do something about it politically, and they went to the state legislature, who had the authority to redraw the lines of the city limits of Tuskegee. And they redrew the lines of the city limits of Tuskegee in what is called gerrymandering to exclude the neighborhoods that these educated Black people lived in, so that our people that had these college educations that would be a threat to the white system of oppression politically would not be able to vote. And so we began to have mass meetings weekly and maybe several times a week. At that time, I was 12 years old. Many things were going on during that time. Martin Luther King was just coming into his dynamic, what I would call spectacular prominence. But not long before that, Emmett Till's body had been discovered in the Tallahatchie River down near Philadelphia, Mississippi, and that was posted. That picture of his body, mangled, bloated body, deformed body, was posted in the Jet magazine, and that had a great impression on all of us, and it stirred us. So we began to have mass meetings, and Martin Luther King was kind enough, as a approximately 27-year-old young man, just having received his doctorate degree, but he came to Tuskegee and he inspired us with his eloquence, and I got a chance to meet him personally, and we developed a lifelong friendship. And I won't go into that because I have another subject I want to talk about, but I just wanted to say that Tuskegee was already glowing. The embers of revolution and rebellion were already started to burn, but when Malcolm came there, the embers had begun to glow. And a student revolutionary, a worker for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was commonly known as SNCC, who was attending Tuskegee, is actually from Tuskegee. His parents worked at Tuskegee. His father worked at the Veterans Administration Hospital and administration. His mother was a teacher at one of the public schools. He had just recently been murdered in cold blood when I left Tuskegee. I left Tuskegee in June of '66. In January of '66, Sammy Young Jr., that's his name, he had just recently been shot down in cold blood in front of a filling station next to the Greyhound bus station. I don't know if they call it Greyhound now. In full view of students that had been returning from their Christmas vacation on that bus. Sammy Young Jr. was a childhood friend of mine, and I was one of the pallbearers at his funeral, and I helped to bury him. And every one of the pallbearers in that limousine had a double-barrel shotgun pointed out of the window in case the Klan wanted to stop our celebration of life of Sammy Young Jr., Tuskegee student, Tuskegee native. I want to say this, and I said 30 minutes, and actually this could go on for hours, but I don't have that kind of time today, but I do want to get to some points. The eminent African-American historian and journalist, Lerone Bennett Jr., he noted that revolutions do not spring full-blown from the head of Zeus or Martin Luther King Jr., or might I add, Booker T. Washington. He observed that revolutions are the product of a discontented spirit that builds up over a period of time and accumulates and strains against the dam of social habit. The dam against which Negro discontent is focused is white power, and any realistic analysis of the Negro rebellion must begin with the Negro situation, a situation defined by power or the lack of it. Now, this is Lerone Bennett speaking. So I go back to my own thesis. In order to fully and accurately appreciate the relationship of my great-grandfather to the Black Revolution, especially as seen by Lerone Bennett in 1965, a century after the legal end of African-American chattel slavery, one must understand that horrific condition. It was the legal and social condition that characterized Booker T. Washington's earliest years. He spent the first 6 or 7 years of his life as a chattel slave, and it marked him for life as an ex-slave. So we're going to just talk for just a minute about what did it mean to be a slave. Most of us have heard of slavery, but we don't know any people personally that were slaves. Well, I happen to have met at least one person who had been a slave. And I won't go into that history. Maybe some other time I'll explain how I met this person and what this person told me. But I will leave you with this. When I met this individual, he was 125 years old. And where I met him was not in Tuskegee, but out in California. But he'd been a slave down south somewhere. And this man worked for an ironworks company that shipped scrap irons on railroad train cars to other places. And this man's job was lifting up pieces of scrap iron and loading them onto conveyors to put them on the train. And he was 125 years old. And people may say, how do you know that, Marshall? No, Dr. Washington, Marshall, how do you know that? Because he showed me a document. He showed me a news clipping that was 10 years old when he was 115, where the city of Oakland, California, surely having verified his age before they put on the citywide celebration in honor of his 115th birthday. Some people may say, well, they may have not really gotten any real validation. I don't know. But I do know this, that he died 10 years later. And ironically, I happened to have been living in Alabama in Huntsville at that time, and I was buying the Huntsville Sunday newspaper every Sunday. And I just happened as perusing through the center section of the paper, they have this like a little magazine, and it celebrated his life. And it said that this man who had been a slave that I knew had just died that year, and he was 135 years old. And why am I saying that? Because since many of us don't know any slaves, we never had a chance to hear anybody talk about what it really was like. So I'm going to tell you what Frederick Douglass, the great Frederick Douglass, a mentor of Booker T. Washington, he came to Tuskegee just before he passed, and he approved of what he saw. It was actually the continuation of his vision for the development of Black people. And I know that just putting those two names together goes against what most of us that came through in the 60s, going to college and graduate school from 65 on, would probably reject, because we always saw Frederick as being a freedom fighter. And many people, not me, saw Booker T. Washington as being accommodationist and even called him a lackey and Uncle Tom and a sellout. But Frederick Douglass did not see him that way. Frederick Douglass would have never acquiesced to come to Tuskegee and give that additional honor to Tuskegee, which was in its young state, if he had not been proud of what Booker T was doing. But another irony is the fact that one of Booker T. Washington's granddaughters, Fannie Washington, married the great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. So right there in Atlanta lives the great-granddaughter of Frederick Douglass and the great-granddaughter of Booker T. Washington, one and the same person. And her son, Kenneth Morris, he doesn't use the name Washington because his father's name is Morris, has started a foundation to fight against slavery wherever it is in honor of his great-grandfather. So Frederick Douglass wrote in his narrative something that some of you may be familiar with, and he described what slavery was. But before I get into that, and I know I've gone past my 30 minutes, I guess, but I want to read this. According to Professor Thad W. Tate, this is a white scholar, he said this: during the last quarter of the 17th century, the end of the 1600s, the status of the Negro in the eyes of the law began to change once more. His personal rights were reduced to a minimum, and he was left as a true chattel slave. As early as 1669, the status of the enslaved African in America had ceased to be that of a man or a woman and had become merely that of a species of property. By the first quarter of the 18th century, the dehumanization of the enslaved Negroes was nearly complete. In fact, Professor Edwin Embry, in his book Brown Americans, related that Henry Berry, one of the legislatures in the House of Burgesses, the state legislature of Virginia, it was called the House of Delegates later. In 1832, he gave a report on the effectiveness of the slave making and slave breaking and dehumanizing of slave program that was going on at that time. And he said this, quote, "We have, as far as possible, closed every avenue by which light may enter the slaves' minds. If we could extinguish their capacity to see the light, our work would be complete. They would then be on a level with beasts of the field, and we would be safe. And I am not certain that we would not do it if we could find the process, and that on the plea of necessity." Unquote. And Edward Embry further noted that the situation did not improve for the Negroes with time, but he said as years dragged on, with slaves and even free Negroes increasingly denied instruction, even the most rudimentary education in the South, and meeting with neglect and intolerance in the North, and emancipation of all the 4 million slaves and 500,000 free Negroes. And that figure actually contradicts the figure that is in a speech that, if I had more time, and unfortunately I don't, that Booker T. Washington gave, where he gave the number as 7 million slaves in the South. But that's all right. The main thing is that no matter how many there were, they were not given education. In fact, at emancipation, not more than 5%, 5% could even read simple sentences or write their own names. And so Booker T. Washington, whose years are still debatable because he says in his autobiography that he was born in 1858 or 1859, but scholars have said that the date in his book was incorrect, which is it's very hard for me to believe he didn't know what year he was born in. His mother probably at least told him that, but they say 1860, 1856. So we use that figure right now, 1856 to 1915. He was born into a milieu of intellectual repression and suppression. And this experience at a very tender age began to breathe the fire of revolution into his soul. How could he not have wanted to change the condition that made his mother have to steal a chicken from the big house, the white folks' house where she was a cook, just to give his children a plate of meat from time to time, because they wouldn't even be so gracious as to give them the leftover pieces of chicken from their dinner table, where she had actually set the table and cooked the chicken. It stirred him, and it began to breathe the fire of revolution into his soul. Not a revolution of the careless, suicidal kind that was espoused by many Black groups during the 1960s. And I lived in Oakland, California, a block away from the Black Panther Party headquarters. I met Huey Newton and Bobby Seale when they came to Berkeley in 1967 to try to recruit the members of the Black Students Union, the newly formed Black Students Union that I was a member of, trying to recruit us into the Black Panther Party. But I think we were, for the most part, too conservative to adopt their idea of revolution. We had our own scholarly idea of revolution. I want to mention this as an aside. Dr. Wright mentioned Professor Frank Tolan. I don't know if he ever actually earned the PhD degree, but he was regarded throughout the American historical scholarly circles as one of the most knowledgeable, erudite, and highly esteemed historians of his time. I knew him as a child. I don't remember taking a history class from him, but I am sure that I knew him as a historian because he was famous all over the campus for his knowledge of our history. And when I was at Berkeley, it was amazing because I just returned to Berkeley from Tuskegee. I just had a chance to talk to Mr. Tolan or Professor Tolan not very long before I left Tuskegee because we were friends. He was one of the older generation, and we were taught to look up to them and let them mentor us, and he was a friend. And I happened to hear, I don't know how I found out, but I happened to hear that he was going to be on the campus of Berkeley doing a visiting lecturer quarter, because the classes were, the schedule was quarterly then. And when I found out he was coming, I was so excited. And I went around, I had just become a member of the Omega Psi Phi fraternity because I pledged at Tuskegee, but I didn't finish until I went out to Berkeley. And I got all of my frat brothers and all of the other Black Greeks on the campus and all of our friends, all of our lady friends. And I got them to sign up for Professor Tolan's class. It was a packed classroom. And that's one of the things I'm proud of because that was the beginning of the Black Studies program at Berkeley, which escalated into a very big thing because it became a movement. By 1969, we were marching and protesting and being attacked because we wanted to learn about our history. But the revolution that the Black Panthers wanted was not to my liking. So Booker T. Washington would have never approved of that. In fact, my grandmother was afraid that he wouldn't have approved of Malcolm because when he was going to be speaking at Logan Hall and I was leaving the house, because I was living with her in the house that Booker T. Washington had built for her and her husband, she said, "I don't think you should go, Marshall." But she called me by my childhood nickname, which I won't say, it's not important. But she said, "I don't think you should go. I'm afraid for you." I said, "No, I have to go." But that spirit, was a part of our time. So that revolution of the spirit, of the morals, of the mental state of the masses of Black people who had been formerly reduced to a mere to a state of mere property of ruthless slave masters for over two and a half centuries was something that he had to do something about. And so I'll close on this note. In his book, Up from Slavery, Booker T. Washington recalled, I had no schooling. Whatever, well, I was a slave, though I remember on several occasions I went as far as the schoolhouse door with one of my young mistresses to carry her books. And I put in parentheses here because I didn't read it. She said it, but I'll tell you something about that. But it's probable that she said to him when he has to go inside with the white kids that were going in to be taught, no, Booker, I can't let you go inside. Learning is not for niggers. Now, I don't like to use that word, and you will very, very rarely hear me use it in a lecture. I just don't feel comfortable using it. But let me tell you something. I was in the United States Navy, and I had a very, very, I guess you might say, comfortable, prestigious job. I won't go into the details, but one of the assignments that I had was to travel to the island of Crete in Greece. And I was there, I was in the training field in the military, and I was there to do some military communications training with a group of people that were stationed there, military people, Navy people. So while I was there, I had with me a device that allowed me to connect with the internet. This is back in the 1990s. And I received an email from a lady who was married to one of the relatives of this lady I'm just talking about that would have said, no, Booker, I can't let you go inside of the schoolhouse. Learning is not for niggers. This particular lady married, was a Burroughs, and the lady that sent me the email married into the Burroughs family. And she sent me an email, and it was a quote from this same lady who said, because she was asked if as a teacher, she helped Booker T. Washington to learn how to read. She said, no, I didn't. In fact, I would have never taught a Negro how to read. Now, in that email, the lady might have changed what the lady really said. Maybe she did say nigger, because that was what they said. But she said in the email, Negro. Besides, I would have never taught a Negro how to, even though Booker T. Washington carried her books to school. So Booker T. Washington said the picture of several dozen little white boys and little white girls in a schoolhouse engaged in study made a deep impression upon me. And I had the feeling that to get into a schoolhouse and study in this way would be about the same as getting into paradise. Now I'm going to have to close now, only because I part of that time for something else, and I don't want to infringe upon the privilege of using this class time to give this presentation. So if you'd like to hear the rest of the presentation, since you're students, most of your students, there may be other guests, if you want to hear the rest of this presentation, get in touch with Professor Daniel, and he'll tell you how to get in touch with me, because I'm not publishing my book and putting it on Amazon for them to be rewarded for my efforts. I'm selling it through my own publishing company, Reality Books. And so he can give you the information, so you can contact me to get a copy of the book, Booker T. Washington for a New America. And you'll be able to hear the rest of what I would like to have told you today. So I want to say thank you all for being so attentive. And I really appreciate the presence of Dr. Wright again. Hopefully we'll get a chance one day to meet one-on-one. Judy Gresham, who is one of your great admirers and a very close friend of mine. She's really like a sister, a real sister to me. Her father was my civics teacher when I went to high school at the used to be Tuskegee Institute High School many years ago. and I really admired him for many reasons, but he instilled in me the desire to become a teacher. And so now I have the opportunity to be a friend of his daughter. So if you're listening, Judy, thank you for telling me about Dr. Tyreen Wright. Dr. Wright, hopefully we'll be able to build upon this 2 times that I've had a chance to be in contact with you. So those of you who want to hear more about what I have to say, just talk with Professor Daniel. He can give you the contact information for me. You're free to do that, Mr. Daniel, Professor Daniel, and I'll be glad to give you. Do you hear what I'm saying? I want the word to get out. I did not really establish this project for the intention of getting wealthy. I could have sent my book to Random House or Simon & Schuster or somewhere probably and gotten an advance. But I decided to post it this way so I could control the total narrative. But for the students that I talk to, and I've been doing this for years, the book is free and nothing's really free. Only thing I want you to do is read it and write me back and tell me what you got out of it in terms of letting you know who Booker T. Washington really was. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Washington.
Thank you. Yes, that was wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
That
you
was
all.
amazing.
Do you have time for one question?
Yes, I can take 1 or 2 questions. Actually, I've arranged my schedule, so maybe a couple, maybe a few questions, but I don't want to get too deep into areas that I may not be the person you need to talk to. Some of the information that you may want to ask me, Dr. Wright, would be much more skilled and trained and adept at answering those questions. So I might have to pass some of them over to you, Dr. Wright.
So I do want
That's
to.
fine. That's fine.
I do want to open it up, and Professor Washington, I know that your time is short, so if you have to check out, feel free to do so. But given the fact that we have such eminent scholars on the call, are there any questions that students have or anybody else that's on the call that they would like to ask? Oh,
I guess my question would be, what advice would you have for members of our generation moving forward for people of our culture and people of the Tuskegee experience? Like what advice do you have for us for the rest of our lives that we should keep in our back pocket?
Thank you for the question. Booker T. Washington was very famous for a particular, among many, but a particular quote that he made in the famous address that he gave, known as the Atlanta Exposition address. And I'm not going to give you that whole soliloquy, but at the end of it, he says, cast down your bucket where you are. Mm-hmm. And then he went on and he gave a litany of places and circumstances where we could cast down our buckets. So my advice is to, first of all, maximize the opportunities that you have. Those of you who are students, some of you I know aren't students, but whatever your particular state in life is right now, but I'm specifically addressing the students with this, take full advantage of every opportunity that you have, not only to master your subjects, that's what you're there for, you pay for that, but to meet the great people that come on campus from time to time. Try to stay in touch with the Student Development Office and get a schedule of people that are going to be visiting the campus and get to meet them. If you only have a minute with them, to say that you met them. That is so important, that you meet these people who have made their mark and can influence you and give you encouragement to go as far as you can go. One of the things that inspired me as a child was meeting Dr. Martin Luther King when I was 12 years old. Later, when I was originally a student at Berkeley right after high school, I had the chance to meet President John F. Kennedy. I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Benjamin Mays, and there are many others that I can name. So when these people come to Tuskegee, get to know them. You may not continue to be in correspondence with them, but they will inspire you because of who they are. And then while you're there, if you're at Tuskegee, if you're at some other school, take full advantage of every opportunity while you're there. The 4 to 6 years is going to go by so fast, to develop a love for some discipline that you want to go to the apex of. When I was a student, we had a visiting professor from Harvard. This was in 1965-66 school year, the same year I met Malcolm. His name was Dr. Starling. He was a Caucasian, he was a white professor. At that time, the president, Dr. Foster, had arranged to bring in some white professors to teach at Tuskegee. I only found out lately that that was part of the agreement for him to get the funding under the newly passed Education Act, that these Black schools that were applying for funding basically had to get mentored, for want of a better term, by some of these larger schools. So Tuskegee went into partnership with Harvard, among several other Ivy League schools. And for that school year, my last year at Tuskegee, there were a number of professors from very, very top-notch schools, including Harvard. And so my point is that Dr. Starling inspired in me the real desire to become a history professor, which is what I do. And I'm not at the level of Dr. Wright, but I do say this, that it's a work in progress. But we need to have the opportunity while we're in college, graduate school, to build a pyramid of dreams with an apex of success and influence. And so my advice to anyone, and I may be getting off the track, but my advice to anyone is to cast down your bucket where you are. Take every advantage that you can to learn your particular discipline and your co-discipline. If you're going to be like a friend of mine, a frat brother of mine, by the way, I'll mention his name. He didn't go to Tuskegee. He went to Clark Atlanta University, but he got his doctorate, his PhD from Michigan State. He's got a double doctorate. His doctorate is in Black Studies, or what I would call African American Studies and Economics. But he established in his mind as an undergraduate at Morehouse that he was going to master whatever he did. And now he is the president and CEO of the National Business League, used to be called National Negro Business League, that was started by who? Tuskegee, president and founder Tuskegee's, you might say, golden child even, Booker T. Washington. So my advice, and I may be getting away from the question, but my advice is, first of all, master whatever you've chosen to be your major. Master it. And you don't have to have a doctorate to have mastered, but it's certainly going to help you to get the doors open where you can use your talents. But the fact is don't leave there feeling you've left any stone unturned in terms of what you could have gotten out of the experience. I wanted to be the president of my class, not because I wanted people to walk up to me and say, Mr. President. I wanted to be the president of my class because I believed that when I got on the podium, not as Booker T. Washington's senior living great grandson, I think he did have a grandson older than me in another generation when I was at school, but still, I didn't want to use that, even though I did talk about him in my speeches going around to the dorms to get elected. I wanted to be able to show them because of my knowledge of Black history, which was one of the things that I was studying, that if you can establish yourself and become honored in whatever you do, you can open the door not only for yourself, but for a whole generation of people. So my advice to you is to see Booker T. Washington as, I don't want to use the word can opener, because, you know, many days as a young frat man used to pop, you know, cans of beverage open, sodas, of course. So I don't want to see you as a can opener, but you should definitely be someone to open the lid off of the bottle of genies so that all of the potential of our people can come out through you. I don't know if I answered your question, but I hope I helped you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Anybody else have, we take one more call, one more question. All right, that must mean that you blew them away, Dr. Washington. Y'all gonna have to stop doing this. Y'all leave my speechless.
This is just some great knowledge. Like, I can't wait to use it. I can't wait to get your book.
Well, all I have to do is get your mailing address. You can give it to Professor Daniel. He'll forward it to me, and I will see that you get it promptly, because I am spreading this around. And the main reason, I'll say this in closing, I will never forget, and I'm not going to take a long time because your class time is almost over, and I realize that, as a matter of fact, it is over. So if you want me to, I'll just cut it short now. But I did want to say one more thing.
Go ahead.
I remember being on the street, Dexter Avenue, in front of the state of Alabama Capitol in March of 1965, when the students from Tuskegee marched from one of the churches over there to the state capitol to deliver a petition to Governor George Wallace. And when we got there, we didn't get a chance to see Governor Wallace. But the students, because we were being coached and led by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee leaders, the chief of whom at that time was James Foreman, an erudite scholar. He had a PhD actually. And he and I butt heads late in the evening of that day. We got there to the Capitol, about 300 and maybe a few more of us, 300 of us. And we were met with a phalanx of highway patrol with long cattle prods, sheriff's deputies on horses with cattle prods, other legions of police. They told us we weren't going to see the governor. We just wanted to deliver a petition to give our people that were trying to get from Selma to Montgomery a chance to get there and petition to have the right to vote. But Dr. Foreman and I got into a little bit of an argument that afternoon, and I won't go into the details of it. But the fact of the matter is that it got resolved peacefully. Now, what I'm saying all this to say is those were some very trying times. And I made a commitment then, because right before that, I had seen some things I won't describe, some brutality visited upon some of my friends. Sammy had not been killed yet. He was in the march with me. We were partners in the march, side by side. But I made a commitment that I was going to stand up for freedom and justice and equality and education. So in closing, I want to say this. The legacy that we have that it's been passed to your generation, if you're students at Tuskegee now, believe it or not, it's still on the drawing board. It's going to be whatever you draw it out to be. Dr. Wright can tell you, having graduated from Tuskegee, I can tell you, having been brought up on the campus and attended school there 2 years, that the dreams that we had as students there have yet to be fulfilled. It's really going to be on your generation to take us to the next level. And I know you will do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
Thank
very, very.
So I'm going to have to say adieu, au revoir, adios, goodbye. But it's been a wonderful pleasure. And thank you so much, Professor Daniel. And I will certainly, if you who are listening, and this goes to those that are going to see this on YouTube, if you'll contact a doctor, and I want to say that, Professor Daniel, and get my email address or my, how to contact me via text message, my phone number is fine. I will send you a book free of charge. You won't even have to pay the postage. If you want to buy a bunch of them, we can work out a good price. How's that?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, I'm signing off now.
Thank you. And Dr. Wright, with you still on, if you're
Yes.
going to answer some questions,
Sure,
I'd be glad
sure.
to direct your way. For the body of folks that were not on Friday, can you quickly just share your credentials as a scholar of Booker T. Washington?
You're Professor Daniels, you're talking to me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, okay. Good. But first I want to say to Dr. Washington, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. And I will be exchanging information with you directly so that we can dialogue. Can you all hear me well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
All
ma'am.
right. I'm gonna let you see me, I think. I hope. I'm gonna try. If you care.
And what I'll say real quick before you get started, for
Okay.
those that are part of the class, if you have to go, you can go ahead and go. I definitely understand it's busy. Everybody may not get as excited as we do about. But if you want to stay on, we'll rock out, as long as Dr. Wright wants to go.
Sure, I'm here for it. Okay. So you had the questions?
Yes. So could you quickly just share with folks your credentials?
Okay. So my undergraduate is Tuskegee University, Department of History, and I graduated in 1996. I actually did study under Professor Tolan. And then I graduated, came back to New York, and I got my master's in modern African history, where I studied independent struggles, the liberation struggles in Africa, the necessity of armed struggle in Africa. And I completed that. And then I went on. I actually was at Temple for 2 years briefly. And then I finished my PhD at Union in Ohio. And I actually wrote my dissertation on Booker T. Washington and African policy. And then some other stuff, but I taught 2 years, for a year, in Senegal at the University of Cheikh Anta Diop, if you know the great historian Cheikh Anta Diop, who wrote Civilization or Barbarism and is responsible for establishing our classical African civilization. And what else? Some other things, but essentially I wrote this book, which is not my dissertation. My dissertation and the book are two very different things. And so the book I wrote on Washington is called Booker T. Washington in Africa, The Making of a Pan-Africanist, where I study specifically Washington's role in Africa and two policy cases where he directly impacts African people globally. So that's a little background on me, amongst other things.
Now, and that's just because I know we have some folks that are on the call or who may watch that were not great present.
Hold on, I must sneeze. Okay, I'm
So
back.
the question that I received from one of the students was, in hindsight, actually this was from one of the alums who was who's watching on YouTube. He said, in hindsight, what mistakes did Booker T. Washington make that have only become clear over time that we should learn from?
I'm moving my camera around, so this looks crazy in terms of recording, but I'm trying to steady it. Well, the biggest mistake Washington made was his role and participation in the Togo Expedition, right? And I talk about that in chapter 4 of the book. And that is the first time that Washington is able to put Tuskegee students on the continent of Africa. And he actually is overzealous in his effort to do that. And he unfortunately sends graduates who will die in Togo before the expedition is over. But I write about it in my book as a turning point for Washington in understanding Pan-Africanism, primarily because, you know, he would be transformed by that experience, and he would turn around and do something very, very, very different after that, right? And so the cases that are the concrete cases in the book, policy cases, the African exclusion measure and the Liberian crisis, come after that situation. Now, this is the thing. The Togo expedition, there is another scholar who has written about it named Zimmerman, and I think there's one other who mentions it in one of his books. I forget the title at the moment. However, because they're talking about it from a very Western perspective, they tend to talk about it as a good thing, the expedition. The expedition, the Togo Cotton Expedition, was really overwhelmingly negative because it was in conjunction with the German colonial forces. It was not to the benefit of the Togolese people. It attempted to recreate oppressive Southern plantation life, and it would only be to the benefit of the German colonial forces, right? And most of all, we have to assess things from a human perspective. The human cost of that expedition was not worth it. It would be tragic in the sense that, once again, all the graduates from Tuskegee that would go there to execute the cotton experiment would die, right? The only accomplishment that came out of it probably was the establishment of a Tuskegee-like school in Togo, and by one of the graduates, and he would do that right before he died and drowned crossing a river in Togo. So it was a catastrophe. It caused a lot of rumblings at Tuskegee. It made it hard for Washington to recruit students to go to Africa after that. It put him into a deep depression. It was catastrophic. And so I think that was one of the biggest mistakes that Washington made, getting involved in that. Now, in contrast, that was the year of 1900, the same year, within the same year as the first Pan-African Conference, he was approached by the German colonial forces. So you have this contrasting activity on the part of Washington. One which sets a path for him long-term as a Pan-Africanist, because he was a key organizer in the first Pan-African Conference. A lot of people get that confused. The first Pan-African Conference and the Pan-African Congresses, which would not start for another 19 years. And Du Bois would be the sole survivor from the conference that would initiate the Congresses, right? But the first Pan-African Conference would, for the first time, organize African people around the world for the purpose of eliminating oppression everywhere we existed. The Togo expedition would be the complete opposite of that. And so if you understand who Washington was via his book, The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery, he tells you that he wanted to go to Africa, that he wanted to be a part of Africa in some significant way, that he realized once he got to Tuskegee that that might not happen. And so he decided to live vicariously through his students. And so he did not qualify the situation. And so through this experience, he understands the way, how we serve African people in particular matters. It cannot be in conjunction with oppressive imperialist forces, particularly in Africa, right? So that was his biggest mistake. And that was a human cost. Now the benefits were that he would be transformed, deeply transformed by the experience. And you would see him assume a very different posture thereafter.
Now, how is there a lesson for us to learn from that experience that we can take into?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's a lesson in that, and then it's a lesson that runs right through all of what we're talking about in terms of Washington, and that is doing for self and independence through industry. And so let me bring it home just a little bit more in order to say that independence allows you to set the terms, right? And lets you decide who you're going to serve and how you're going to serve them, right? And so putting Tuskegee graduates on the continent of Africa through the German colonial forces was wrong, but you see the vehicle through which he chose without assessing or qualifying it was problematic. And then over and again, you hear after this concept of independence through industry, being able to own the industry, establish that industry, master that industry, and this allows you to set the terms. You heard Dr. Washington just now say that he could have given his book to any other publisher, a big publishing house. This is very true. I'm also an example of someone who took my book back from an academic publisher and decided to put it under my own independent imprint, right? It wasn't self-published, but it is under my own imprint. I own the publishing. And so that allowed me to be more truthful, right, about Washington and to tell the story truthfully and not be beholden to the academy in my telling of the story, because we have to understand with Booker T. Washington, part of the reason why this is a big deal that we're learning this information now is because of the fact that the academy and specific white liberal scholars like Lewis Harlan and Van Woodward would have a monopoly on the interpretation of Washington and would get a chance to write both of Washington's autobiographies, and Harlan would edit all 15 volumes of Washington's personal papers, of which I found numerous mistakes and errors in. So that in and of itself lets you know that when you are the progenitor of something, you have mastered something, you have more freedom. And so when you see Washington or examples of Tuskegee on the continent thereafter, they are independent models for the most part. They are people who are initiating institutions, organizations, and so on and so forth. And so that theme is consistent in the Tuskegee model, the Tuskegee philosophy, Washington's philosophy, and thereafter, this concept of independence through industry.
So can you, and when looking at what's going on right now in society, we hear about climate change, we hear about global warming.
Yes.
One of the big projections with climate change is that there would be increased disease vectors, and the fact that we're now, all of us are quarantined, literally around the world as a result of COVID-19.
Right.
It brings to light the seriousness and also the fragility of our society, our world society.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at so this idea of independence and Booker T. Washington's model, that Tuskegee model, can you speak about what that model looks like, particularly from a sustainability standpoint? Like what did he say then that is still true today that we could learn from as we go forward?
Well, that's okay. The question itself is a good question because there's a lot in terms of the understanding the Tuskegee model. I actually wrote a whole chapter in the book called the Tuskegee model and Africa, right? Because Washington seeks to, once perfecting this model, he seeks to export this model to Africa and throughout the African world. However, the last part of your question is like the new question, right? And unfortunately, I don't know how much is still implemented today, which is why I'm always careful when I lecture on the subject matter.
Well, I mean, in terms of what could be translated, because we're talking about from this philosophical approach that
right.
was not philosophical in delivery. It was
Right.
actual delivery, but there still was a philosophy
Right.
behind it. What of that philosophy has value in today's world, given the changes that are taking place?
Oh, okay. Well, all of it, because more and more, especially because of the circumstances. But, you know, Tuskegee very early on is a very sustainable model. Let me say one thing about the history that a lot of people don't really realize. Um, Washington is not really the initial founder of Tuskegee, as many of us know who are Tuskegeans, right? He is I always call him, I call him in my book in particular, I call him the father of Tuskegee, in the sense that he raised it up from the ground, you know, because when he comes, it's a one house, you know, one room school, right? In an AME church. But Lewis Adams, right, is the formerly enslaved person who essentially responds to Foster in organizing the Black vote in Tuskegee. And when he is to be rewarded or awarded for organizing that Black vote of Tuskegee or in Tuskegee, he says simply that he wants a school for his people, right? And to me, I think that that's so profound because you know, think of all the things, the personal benefits that people would ask for now. And he had none of that going on. His request was not for himself, but for us collectively. But Washington did something that was equally as important, which was that he would make the institution independent of the state of Alabama, right? What Lewis Adams did through Foster would give that $2,000 allotment for teacher salaries and nothing else. No building, no nothing. So the school was housed in a small AME church there in Tuskegee until Washington gets there and he begins to build it. And so he raises it, right? He is truly Tuskegee's father in that sense. But what he does, he makes the institution independent. He gives it a solid board. He makes it independent, meaning independent from the state of Alabama, right? So Tuskegee, as you guys may know, is quasi-private, one of the few institutions in the United States that has that classification. I believe it's only one of two that have that classification, private and state affiliated when it needs to be. And that's kind of a real Booker T. Washington mark, because he was a true politician. Anyway,
I think we're losing you.
Went to school part-time, during 10 years, and 4 years, she went to school full-time. So you have the institutional labor force that would weather economic hardship. One. Two, you have students engaging in
Okay, I think we lost Dr. Wright. Sounded like she had some technical difficulties. So is there anybody else who has some questions that you would like to ask while we wait for her to return? We'll probably ask, one, maybe two more questions and then conclude.
Turn it out.
So so no one has any questions?
No, sir.
Oh man. So what do y'all think about, y'all have gotten some real gems of knowledge in the last 2 sessions. What do y'all think about all this wonderful stuff?
I'm just grateful for the opportunity to hear from these people because it's rare. It's like, who would have known that you were in contact with these people? Like, that's his great, I don't even know how many great grandson. That's if you really think about it, that's amazing. That's a rarity. Like you said, that's a gem. And I'm just, as he even said, the advice he gave, I'm grateful to be able to just have met them and interact with them.
Well, I hope, I hope that y'all take away the responsibility that you all have, that we all have, right? We all have this responsibility as Tuskegee alums, or soon to be alums, to carry on his legacy for what Tuskegee is supposed to be and who we are supposed to be as Tuskegee students. Remembering that we have a responsibility to the community surrounding the campus, because our university was born out of the community. And that's something that we all have to keep in the forefront of our minds, that we are the brain trust of the Tuskegee community. As it goes, as we go, it goes. And we have to go together, right?
So Dr. Daniels.
Yes, it sounds like.
This is Norma. I just want to thank you and to the students. This is a fellow alum class of the Institute class of 1978. So I'm just pleased to be in you all's company. But I just want to thank Dr. Daniels for his vision and his foresight. And I just want to speak to what you asked, the last question that you posed, really briefly. We're in a time right now where Tuskegee can continue to be that place that people look to for answers and that place that people look to for refuge. Because as we look at things like food security in the future and those kinds of things, we're primed to be a place in the Alabama Black Belt that can serve the people. And that's a part of Tuskegee's mission, has always been a part of his mission. So I just want to thank you, Dr. Daniels, for your vision and your foresight.
Well, I definitely can't take credit for the course. I can take credit for being honest enough to raise my hand and say I'm willing to step in the ring and see how I can properly represent Dr. Washington to our student body. And so yes, I can take that much.
Well, we appreciate it. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. You're very, very welcome. Well, for the students, as I posted today, for the final project for the semester, I would like you to write a 500 to, I believe I said 1,000 pages. 500 to 1,000 words, not pages. Defining Booker T. Washington's legacy. So for those that are watching, we've been able to digest Booker T. Washington's legacy, or Dr. Washington's legacy, as it relates to education, or better yet, I'm gonna let y'all tell it, since y'all have been here. What is his legacy? We'll pick on somebody in a second. Ms. Swain, what would you say is his legacy?
I would say his legacy is the way he taught was with your hand, head, and heart. Like that's the main goal. That's the main reason. Mainly through your heart, your head, and your hands.
Okay, definitely.
School with their hands, and he taught with his heart, and they gathered it with their head, with the knowledge.
Okay, so that's his educational legacy. I see Dr. Wright is back.
Yes, I am. My phone literally died on me in the middle of that. So I apologize. I had no clue.
No worries, no worries.
Modern technology.
Hey, we're getting to push it to its limits.
I know, right?
They were actually just giving a brief overview of Dr. Washington's legacy.
Okay.
And so I'll let them jump in and add a few more and then let you round us out.
Okay.
So I'm gonna
I
call
don't know
on.
how much you heard of what I said before I got cut off, but
I gotta be honest, I don't recall how much I retained because it got really garbled for probably about a minute and a half. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
But I'll let you all finish and then I'll jump in and
Okay.
wrap up or answer anything that was unclear.
Okay. Ms. Butler, can you speak quickly about Booker T. Washington's legacy, from those topics that we've covered?
Where's Miss Butler? Okay. So, So some of his legacies was passing down information and making sure that we like kind of be independent. And I guess learning about the Togo today, he was trying to take that out to Africa, but it didn't work as well. And so he came back and like looked at his process out here and started living through his students. Okay. And then from that, I kind of was like, from all that, maybe we not, I don't know, because I don't know too much about Africa. After this conversation, I would definitely do some more research and learn more about the government and things like that. But it's like, were we meant to even do that in Africa, or were we just only supposed to do it, in the United States? Or I don't know. Should we start us another town, or should we just keep building from Tuskegee and just keep going bigger and bigger? But I feel like the repercussions if we do that, like if like we really like strategize and build our own banks and created our own business, like I don't know what kind of repercussions we would get.
So, I mean, I think if we think back with Dr. Washington and his work, domestically, he was building businesses. I mean, if we think about the time period when he was doing this, we're very segregated. We see the result of one of the towns that he promoted, which was Black Wall Street. We know its story as it got bombed, but that's also one of the towns that he promoted. In addition to Eatonville and Mound Bayou and Hobson City. I mean, he's traveling all over the country promoting these towns and discussing how we can be independent. We can have these independent communities. And you think about Mound Bayou, not only does he establish a bank there through the National Negro Business League, and we learned this through the conversation with the mayor of Mound Bayou, but he also promoted Mound Bayou as one of the ideal towns for independence and growth. And here, this is a town that's over 130 years old that's still independent and predominantly African American, as a community. So I think there's a lot. And let me grab one more person, Ms. Smith. Can you speak to another aspect of Booker T. Washington's legacy that people would not know or may not be as familiar with? See if Mr. Smith still on the call. If not, Mr. Douglas, you still on?
I am, but I think my phone is about to die.
Okay. All right. Do you want to throw in your thoughts real quick before he goes?
I guess real quickly, I would say that my thoughts about Booker T. Washington's legacy was not only to teach, the Black men and women how to take the ground that they're walking on and make it, like turn it into value, but also to inspire others. Because yes, he did all these amazing things, but I'm sure if he just wanted it, just to be his own, creation or his own achievement, it would have just been that. He wouldn't have made, forgot what the name of that book was, but that book where he basically designed, or it was instructions on how to build an entire university or an entire city.
Working with the hand?
Yes, working with the hand, exactly. Like where he thoroughly explains how to build an entire community from the wood from the trees and the dirt.
Sorry.
Yeah.
When you're talking about rural education.
Right, yes, rural education. I knew it was one of those, but I feel like that's kind of the legacy that he's putting, or that's the legacy that I'm getting from him, where no matter what, wherever you are, you can take like the world around you and bend it to your will so that you can create value out of it. Like he's teaching the Black people as a whole that, you are valuable in that the work that you do is valuable, and you can make a profit, and you can learn from what's given to you in the world, not just by what's been told for you to do. Like we were told to build, the White House and all these houses, but we didn't really acknowledge the fact that we knew what we were doing after a while, because I'm pretty sure after a while, slaves were starting to tell slaves or teach slaves, okay, this is how this building is put up. And so after a while, we know how to build a building. We know how to farm. We know how to raise cattle and livestock. We know how to make clothes. We know how to pave roads. And so Booker T just exploited all of this knowledge and made it known that, look, you know how to do this. Why don't you do it for yourself? And so I guess that's the legacy he's trying to give off is, you have this power and I'm going to bring it out of you. And this is what you can do with that power. That's what I'm gathering from that.
Man, that's powerful. Dr. Wright, you want to follow that?
Yes, I was trying to unmute it. Yes, Professor Daniels, that reminds me of, and I realized that I didn't do it for the class, or you all tell me if I did, but there was a quote where that I included in the book that is from Arthur Evans, who was the staff correspondent of the Chicago Record-Herald. And, I can go on and on about what Tuskegee was, but there were people who were outside of Tuskegee who actually noticed what the model was about. And the quote I had used before was specifically this in an article. It said, a school, Tuskegee is not a school in the ordinary sense of the word. It is a city in itself, a community that dominates a whole county. It's an industrial plant that with 40 trades and industries that consumes all its own products, that erects its own buildings, first by making its own bricks, that grows its own food, makes its own clothes, writes and prints its own textbooks, all by way of education. And so the point is that, yes, Washington was very specific. I mean, in the chapter on Booker T. the Tuskegee Mile in Africa, it is very clear that I make it very clear that one, he wanted to get to Africa. Two, he realizes that he's not going to get to Africa, so he puts his students on the continent of Africa. Three, what he is doing is something very specific. Once he perfects the Tuskegee model of sustainability, which is that everything that is a human necessity for man, woman, and child, we are producing ourselves and consuming ourselves. So if it's consumable, then it's producible, meaning if we need it, then we need to produce it. When I came to Tuskegee, there used to be an ongoing joke that in the milk bank, right, the large animal farm, that we used to consume the milk in the milk bank. It very likely is true. I mean, why wouldn't it be true? I mean, who else would have been drinking the milk besides the students? But the students were the school's consistent labor force that allowed it to weather economic hardships. It was producing everything that was utilized there. And what Tuskegee had to offer the world was its 44 industries. In the vocational classes, what you were weighed and measured upon and graded on was your ability. If you were in wheel writing, your grade in wheel writing was not on whether or not you could make a wheel, but whether or not you could make a wagon.
Mhm.
Okay. And I include this because how I research the book is, of course, I go into Tuskegee Archives itself and get the first curriculum, the first course offerings. And, so it's an interesting thing. Dr. Washington was very correct that the way people talk about Tuskegee as an industrial and vocational school, but even the charter in 1893 says that it is a school for teachers that teaches the academics and the vocations. So it's meant to educate people. And we know for a fact that Tuskegee produced more college educated Black people than manual laborers. Okay. What it was meant to produce a cadre of people, a class of people who were academically educated, but also had mastery in at least 2 industries, to the point that they could go on and teach others on how to teach these industries. This is why I talked about Elizabeth Wright, who established Voorhees. Voorhees is a vocational and industrial school. Truly, unlike Tuskegee, whether you like it or not, then or now, I think, to answer your other question, Professor Daniels, Daniels, is a school for teachers that also taught mastery of the industries, right? And skill set. But it really was meant to produce people who could establish institutions themselves and businesses and organizations that would be perpetual for us, right? As opposed to us going to work for anyone. That's why the quote that one of the students in this class did, that was actually Lewis Harlan, about independence about separation and independence and what Tuskegee really was. Although it was not Lewis Harlan, although it was Thomas Dixon, the author of The Klansman, right, which was the screenplay really for the book, the film Birth of a Nation. Although that's who it was, he was on point because Washington did conceal the true design and model of Tuskegee. He was not transparent about that. Even further, let me say this about Tuskegee and the propaganda that precedes both the institution and Washington. Washington wore a mask because he had to. Some people wear a mask because they don't know what else to do, but he was very clear about what he was doing. He knew that what he was doing at Tuskegee would give us the kind of independence that would be intolerable to American white society. So Jabavu, someone else in the class talked about him. Jabavu was very correct about him in his writing of My Tuskegee Pilgrimage that Washington understood that what he was doing was very serious, and it could have gotten him and the whole institution obliterated. What he thought about what he was trying to do with this model, I'm very clear about that because he is very clear about that. He specifically wanted to share this with Africa first and foremost, in the Americas and throughout the African world, which would be the Caribbean, Central, and South America. Okay. The last case in my book, which is the African Exclusion Measure, highlights that. Why? Because while he's trying to stop the US government from passing immigration policy that would have locked out Black or African students from everywhere in the world from 1915 on, the students, although his efforts would be successful and secure everyone, he was particularly concerned about his steady flow of students from the continent of Africa. He makes no mistake about it. And he is very clear in his personal papers about this. And the only group of people who write him and thank him for his efforts in debunking this unfair and racist immigration policy are his students from Africa. Okay. And he was very clear on that. He didn't have a problem serving everyone else, but he certainly wanted to serve his steady flow of students from Africa. He had a love and affinity for Africa that is unparalleled. And why? Because it comes from his mother. He understood his mother was an African person. I don't have any images of her. We don't know what she looked like, but to him, in his eyes, he understood she was a product of African people, culture, so on, and the continent. And he said that a people that could produce his mother must have some good in them that geographers had failed to discover. And so he thought fundamentally, my mother is good, therefore the people that produced her had to be good. And he associates and identifies his mother as a descendant of Africa, not anywhere else. And he doesn't over pontificate about any other ancestry on top of that. So he is he is also explicit in the story of the Negro about saying he wanted to be in service to Africa and African people in some significant way. So he's not how would you say, vague about what he was trying to do. It's just that the writing of Washington and his legacy has been fumbled by the academy. Okay. The academy, Black scholars, African scholars have allowed white liberal males in particular in the academy to write everything you know about Booker T. Washington and most of all Tuskegee. So this is why we don't know this. So it's kind of how would you say, a reckoning, for this history to come full circle, right? There's a saying, Maya Angelou writes in that poem, truth crushed to the ground still rises, right? So it's not going to be buried forever. There'll always be someone who comes along and digs this history up because it's written down. And the great thing about writing is that it allows a level of immortality. When you write it down, as long as someone else finds it or it's produced, it lives even after you're gone. And so Washington was brilliant. He wrote, his whole life was accounted for. It just was in his personal papers. And however his personal papers were able to be released, this is why we're able to lift all of this history up and reconcile the misconceptions, the myths, the lies, essentially, that have been written into history about this. So just so I'm not, because I could go on all day as well. He wanted this model that was Tuskegee with 44 industries to be spread to the African world first and foremost, which is why at the International Conference on the Negro in 1912, that was held at Tuskegee, which was Washington's Pan-African conference, so to speak. This is why he invites everyone throughout the African world, and he opens up all the industries on display at the campus and says, take whatever you can back to wherever you are. We're not saying we're doing the best of everything, but we may have some methods here that you have not experienced, saw, or thought of. And so we are opening this up to share with the world, and one of the African world in particular. And the resolution, one of the resolutions in that particular conference was to erect a Tuskegee-like institute in Jamaica, right? And I think I mentioned the other day, this is how Garvey ends up connecting with Booker T. Washington directly via the 8 Jamaican educators or teachers that come to the conference and then bring evidence of what they saw back to Marcus Garvey. So he wanted to export this all over the African world, and he did that 3 ways. One, through his graduates, one through the graduates, the other was through international students, right? Students who were from other places, of which there were many. There were many students from the Caribbean, Central and South America who came. And he, at the end of my book, I give, instead of like notes, the notes are a lecture he gives at this conference on the responsibility of returning to our communities. That was the Tuskegee mission also, to return to your community and build, right? And not forsake your community, not take the knowledge and run off into the sunset and only liberate yourself with it, but to share it with your own community. So the concept of the right of return, so to speak, in the sense that we had to return to our own communities, be it domestically or internationally, to build and implement the mission, the Tuskegee mission. And he talks about that. And then the third way he spreads the Tuskegee model is through his African nationalist affiliates, who he is in contact with, people like Jabavu, people like Deuce Muhammad Ali, who is aware of the Tuskegee model, people like Duze in South Africa. There's so many, even in the Togo Expedition, the last surviving graduate is able to duplicate the institution in some form. And there are numerous. In my chapter 4 of the book, I spent a whole, very challenging chapter talking about all the ways in which the Tuskegee model would be exported once perfected, right? So I don't know. I think that answers your question. And going forward for sustainability, yes, Tuskegee was sustainable. It was a sustainable model. Some people say, oh, well, maybe it wasn't because you still needed white philanthropic monies. And I would have to say, like, no, not necessarily. Sure, you needed an injection of monies at a certain point because the students were laboring, but they were paid. That's the other part of it. They were not unpaid laborers. There was no slavery or anything like that going on. It was not unpaid labor. When they are in the work program, which existed all the way up to the 70s, to my knowledge, they were actually being paid for the labor they provided to the school, working in the offices and working on many levels throughout the school, be it manual labor or administrative type of staff support in labor. So, but in terms of the sciences, that Tuskegee has serious mastery in the sciences, agriculture, small and large animal. So the ability to produce food is one thing that we're going to have to talk about going into the future. And we should always already be talking about it as Black people in America when we have such poor quality of food, even in the most affluent Black communities, right? So I could live in New York in a tax bracket where the houses are $400,000, but go to the supermarket and all the food is all the fish are farm raised, right? Which that's a whole nother story. I went wild. I don't want a fish that was in like the toilet bowl, right? Which essentially that's what farm raised is like, it's very polluted and toxic. So my point is that a lot of us don't know those simple things because we're not into food, we're not into food production, but these are some of the things that were in use at Tuskegee, and also the importance of people like Carver, who helped farmers not only do what they did, meaning produce food, but engage in subsistence farming, produce for their communities and produce for themselves, in addition to not raping the land, right? Soil replenishment, which have a lot to do with the sweet potato, right? Crops that replenished, not raped the soil. So these are all things, these strategies and methods used at Tuskegee are things that we are going to have to conjure going forward, because one, we're in a situation we don't know how it's going to go out. We all might want to know how to produce food and produce food in a way that is going to be sustainable and not costly to the earth itself and our environment, right? So food production shouldn't destroy the environment, right? So which, if we want an example of that, we can look at the island of Hispaniola, present day Haiti. Okay. We know that just from the air, if you look at the geography of Haiti, when the French colonial forces were there, they raped the land. Okay. And you can see that it's no longer arable and viable for production. If you wanted to understand, a stark contrast. The same was not necessarily the case for the Dominican Republic side, but then there's also dynamics between the French and the Spanish colonial or Spaniard colonial forces that occupy that island, but you can see it visually, an example of one imperialist nation that just destroyed the environment, the land, and then another that did some other things that were just as bad, decimated the population, so on and so forth, but just didn't do that one thing, right? Commit that atrocity against the land and the environment. So that's the difference. And Carver brings that piece to the puzzle in terms of the sustainable model, right?
So we have one question.
Miss Gresham,
Yes, ma'am.
are you struggling there? Hi, Dr. Wright, and
How are you?
I am wonderful. Oh my goodness, I hate to always be so emotional. First of all, to Professor Washington, that was wonderful, and I have been struggling here in the background with some technical difficulties, so I've missed quite a bit, but I've been in for the last, I guess, 15 minutes or so, 30 minutes maybe. But I just wanted to, first, there's so many things to say. I wanted to just introduce myself again to the students because I'm Judy Gresham, and I'm a native of Tuskegee. And also I attended Tuskegee University. My mother and father met there. My mother was one of the founding charter members of AKA at Gamma Kappa Tuskegee. And my daughter just graduated, Candace Gresham, from Tuskegee in 2017.
Wow.
So, and I also am the director of an organization called the Tuskegee Seeds of Greatness. And that organization was basically put together to recognize the preservation of historical value of Tuskegee University and the town, the community. And so we have a board member of a lot of Tuskegee alums who are also natives, but they also graduated from Tuskegee. So I'm really wanting to focus a lot of my work now on Booker T. Washington, along with helping our candidate Norma Iyabode McGowan Jackson become the city councilwoman, because she and I are just so passionate about Booker T. Washington. We read the book. I don't know if the students have also read Marshall's book, which he's already talked about, and I thought it was awesome that he's offering the book, a copy, to students who will write him. But also, I had a couple of quick questions. One was, I wanted to comment because I'm going to attach a video that I've discovered on YouTube to your Facebook Messenger, Dr. Wright. I've already
Okay.
shared it. Yeah, I've already shared it with Professor Washington and Professor Daniels and Councilwoman McGowan Jackson.
Okay.
Soon to be anyway. But I wanted to I found a video. I had started looking at some different YouTube things. I think it's Voice of Africa, VOA, African leaders, and they were discussing, there's a video called the role of Africa, the role of HBCUs in Africa. And it was a discussion. I'm bringing this up because of a comment you made about 10 minutes or so ago. They were discussing, it seems, I haven't gone back to look at it again, but it seemed very current, and they were discussing an initiative of some sort. And they had a panel discussion, I think it's about an hour long, and they had different representatives, African, some were leaders, but they had all attended HBCUs in the States, but they were, they were Africans. So the woman who was leading the discussion was from, how she graduated from Howard, and another one was from Morgan State, and another, I think, from Livingston. And they just discussed all of these roles historically that HBCUs have played in Africa. And they went on, and I was in awe where you're saying a lot has been, kept hidden. They not one of them. They had a very, somewhat scholarly conversation. They mentioned absolutely nothing about Tuskegee University, absolutely nothing about Booker T. Washington. They mentioned Garvey and Du Bois and all of that. But I was just amazed, not amazed, because we know this stuff has been very much, like you said, handled. So I wanted to bring it up. Yeah, that was case in point for that. Because this is, and hopefully I've encouraged Professor Daniels, to hopefully look into it a little more after he watches the video, because surely this could be a great opportunity, and you as well, to get Tuskegee involved, the university, to get the Tuskegee model talk more about and implement it over in that program as well. Educate all of these so-called scholars who are alums of all these other HBCUs. Right. And I just thought it's a great opportunity that could, so that was one point. The other thing that I wanted to tell you, I've had a conversation with Professor Washington and Professor Daniels since your last time speaking on Friday. And I have to compliment you, because you are just it's unbelievable how thorough you are with your research and your,
thank you.
Oh my goodness. And also just the fact that you have such a passion.
Thank you.
The passion is so evident. And the fact that, as I told them both, and we all discussed and agreed, your continuous digging, you're challenging, you want to get to the bottom. And I just applaud you. Of course, being a Tuskegean, because I think when you said 96, I was here for a hot minute. I came back as a returning student. The last question is, I wanted to find out, and you may have covered this, so I'm sorry if I'm bringing up something you've already talked about, but there was conversation. I've talked with Professor Washington, and even recently, about the fact that Booker T. Washington was killed. When I read half of your book, when I got halfway through, I was like, okay, they killed him. When I saw how involved he was with Africa, knowing the history of these Europeans, and when they find out you're doing stuff, I said, yep.
Oh yeah.
So have you done anything? I know that in talking to Professor Washington, had you talked about this today? I'm sorry.
Oh, no, we haven't talked about that, but I think it might have been touched on in the previous conversation. I'm not sure, but so that being said, I wouldn't be surprised, right?
And before you respond, let me just add this to it. I've been talking to Professor Washington over the last couple of years. He had already shared with me that there is a book that was written.
By a woman.
Yes, and that she's taught. So he was confirming that last night. So I wanted to bring that to bring that up in the conversation and see what you had to share on that. I'm sorry, I was so long-winded.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'm gonna,
Okay.
I'm gonna try to hit each point, but, um, so you read my book, so you know that he was up to a lot.
Yes. Oh my God.
And
Yeah.
he, certainly, I mean, personally, I don't know how he survived doing all of that. Uh, to try to just touch on it, I allude in the preface of the book about why I start to understand that Washington isn't the person that people think he is. And I begin with that in the preface, and I start to talk about what he was doing with the lynching files and how the lynching files, the present day lynching files, came about. Most people don't know that every lynching account, visual image that you have of lynching was actually compiled by Booker T. Washington himself. There was no one else doing that work. And yes, he garnered serious challenges from someone who I respect and love as well, Ida B. Wells, right? Barnett. However, he was the compiler of the lynching files, or the actually Tuskegee University newspaper clippings collection on lynching, and that would turn into the lynching files that now presently you all know are on microfilm and sold to archives and universities and other libraries around the world today. And it is over 2,000 images and articles of lynchings across the United States from 1895 to 1950. That alone, well, one, why was he doing that? He was mapping them, right? He was like, where are they? What are they doing? Who are they doing it to? What are the trumped up charges or accusations that they're using? And he had a reason to. I mean, he was responsible for the lives of everyone who was at Tuskegee, right? And we can certainly understand. We understand what Tuskegee was and even is now. So you had some of the first people that would ever go to college at this institution, and he was responsible for their safety and their security, which is part of the reason why I have to say I have nothing against Du Bois, but I hate to hear Washington even being compared to Du Bois, because Du Bois was responsible for his own life and he would do many things with it, but Washington was responsible for many lives. And I've had to explain that to my other Tuskegee alumni, who are my friends who came through Tuskegee, who I have, while writing this book, had to explain to them the weight and the stress of raising an institution and becoming an institution builder. And aside from that, burying two wives who were also institution builders, and it put them in their graves, right? Because to be an institution builder is a very difficult thing. Institution builders usually do die early. That being said, he still was doing enough that many people could have had a problem with, that would have put him in danger of having his life taken. We know that because of several things. The gesture from Thomas Dixon. Thomas Dixon is a raging racist who is well known. And he writes this article in the Saturday Evening Philadelphia Post, right? I said it wrong, but it's just, it's the Saturday Evening Post in Philadelphia, something to that effect. You'll see the citation in the book. But the point is that he writes this article, The Dangerous Aspects of the Work at Tuskegee, and I only give you a bit of what he's saying in there, but what he's saying to American whites is that this guy Washington, he has you fooled. He's dangerous. You get what I'm saying? He's dangerous. And I'm trying to alert you all to it. He's not teaching these people to be servants. He's teaching them to be masters of men. Do you get what I'm saying? That is a serious thing. So that alone, that was a rallying cry, just as much in the same way that the book that Thomas Dixon would write would be a rallying call to white racists. It would be the second resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Birth of a Nation. That would be their call to arms. when I was at Tuskegee, my senior seminar, and Professor Fluker had a little bit of an issue with this at first, but then it turned into something very good. So I know what Dr. Washington was talking about. I drew on everything that was there at Tuskegee. Trust me, I have used what I did at Tuskegee all the way, obviously, through to my graduate education and beyond, right? So I'm like 20 years plus out of Tuskegee, and I'm still doing work related to it. And don't get me wrong, I think it was just the spirit of our ancestors, Washington and others, that brought me back to the work, because I was not planning to even write my master's thesis on it. But I wrote both my master's thesis on Washington and Africa and my dissertation, and then this book. So, and that was not the plan. It was not planned that way. It happened that way, even for my dissertation. But my point of bringing up Thomas Dixon, so I don't go off on a tangent, Thomas Dixon wrote The Klansman. And what I did at Tuskegee in my senior seminar was I did a study of the resurgence of the Alabama Klan. And Professor Fluker, Dr. Tolan was my advisor on that research project. And I actually contacted the Southern Poverty Law Center and was actually going to do some interviews, because I was so tired of books. I wanted something I could feel. And that was how Professor Tolan sent me to the archives and said, go look at the lynching files, one. And then the other thing was, which will give you an understanding of what Tuskegee was way back when, and even when I was there, I had set up an appointment with the Southern Poverty Law Center to interview two former Klansmen. I was a little overzealous, I'll admit, as a history student. And the appointments were made, and they contacted me and told me to come to Montgomery to the Southern Poverty Law Center. By all means, it's legitimate, long-standing institution, has done work, Klan Watch, done many things. It's also the holder, probably has a copy of the lynching file, so on and so forth. So to me, this is not a big deal, but I kind of wanted to do a little, more than just some books. Anyway, Professor Tolan said to me, and then Dr. Benford said to me also as well, Miss Wright, you're not going to Montgomery to interview anyone. And I was like, yes, I am. I have my appointment. And they said, no, you're not, because we can't protect you if you leave Tuskegee, period. Okay, so in Tuskegee, I was safe. But if I left Tuskegee, I would not be safe. And we have to understand what Tuskegee was then and now. So it was a safe space for us to a degree. And so that put it into my overzealous, campaign of interviewing people about the Klan. But my point is that I gained valuable knowledge because I was sent to the lynching files. And this is the first time I understand that Washington is not who we think he is. He was not just sitting on that information. He would produce data, statistical data, as a result of collecting all of these newspaper articles. And he would generate numbers mapping where they were and what they were doing in terms of lynching. It would be later on that he comes out and he speaks on lynching, but he had been silent most of the time because he had the weight of protecting Tuskegee on his shoulders. And fast forward, Dixon is aware of who Washington is. Later on, you have other students who visit Tuskegee from Africa, and it occurs to them, like Jabavu said, that these venomous, he was preoccupied with maintaining his relationship with venomous Southern whites who at any moment could bomb the whole campus and lynch him and his students all in one night. Tuskegee is surrounded by white counties. So we know this, even though it is part of that doubling down and creation of the Black Belt in the South, right? So my point is that Washington could have easily worked himself into the ground as an institution builder. However, I assure you, when Professor Daniels gets my book, he will see And as you already have the book, you will see the way that he is speaking to powerful white men is something that is not even happening now. We are not doing any of what he was doing now. Okay. So he could have easily been murdered. He actually is lucky that he died peacefully of what we think was an illness, but some believe it was a poisoning. But my point is that he didn't die violently as he could have. He could have easily. The rule with lynching at that time during the Nader, 1895 to 1915, our lowest point where we are experiencing a disproportionate amount of systematic violence by white Americans. This is a period they love to hide. You understand how much violence was visited upon the Black community as a result of our progress, sheer progress, and the anger around our progress in 50 years out of slavery. So he could have easily been murdered in a violent and open way, because that is their remedy for Black competition, to just straight out murder people at that point in time. There are numerous examples of that. It wasn't the thief per se that was murdered. It was the prominent, well-known progressive person in Black communities who was lynched, so that they can send a very clear and direct message that this and more can happen to you, right? And lynching wasn't hanging. Lynching is, I think I mentioned it in the presentation, it was tar and feathering someone, burning them at the stake, shooting them to pieces, maiming them in some horrific way, and then hanging their body from a tree to put them on display and terrorize the living. The hanging wasn't for the dead, it was to terrorize the living. And so that was the vein of the day. And then of course, you know, you send these pictures of dead people to your family members on postcards, you know. So America was a bizarre and brutal and violent place in that period. Not to erase anything that's going on now, because I'm not gonna even argue that it's that much different. However, they didn't hide their faces back then, and he could have easily been lynched with no recourse, right? In spite of how important he was to us, he could have been lynched without any recourse, maybe some finger shaking from some white philanthropist who would have said we had relationships with him, but no one would have gone to jail for sure. And so to answer your question about that, the book, I don't know the author's name off the top of my head, but I am familiar with the title, 60 Days Till Death, or something to that effect is the title. Yes, she's on the right path. Inside Tuskegee, we all know that this is at Tuskegee, this is a conversation, and some people accept it as fact that Washington was murdered. But we don't have the scientific evidence to say that he was in fact poisoned, but he certainly, all that I write about him, you or I or any of us will be in serious trouble and or at least starve if we did half of what he did, for sure.
Wow, that's amazing.
Man, I know I'm not starved. I am so full. I mean, it's very rare you can say you're full of knowledge.
Right.
And between you and Dr. Washington, y'all have filled me, and I know you filled our students, and anybody else who gets on and watches this later. So I'm really honored that you allowed us to air it live.
No problem.
This is the type of.
And I'm gonna sneeze. Excuse me.
Okay, no. I mean, this is the type of narrative that needs.
Okay, I'm back.
This is the type of narrative that needs to go out.
Right.
the truth is the narrative has to come out of Tuskegee. You know, just like you said, you have everybody else telling our story and they're saying it as the gospel. And for every single one of us that's done even a little bit of scholarship on Tuskegee, you begin to realize that when you vet some of the folks that are having conversations about Tuskegee, they have not engaged in true scholarship about Tuskegee.
Right.
They can get away with pushing something out that is subpar strictly because there's nobody out there to challenge it.
Right.
And that's because too many of us have not engaged in the scholarship.
Right.
So I'm honored to be able to say that, as an alum to another alum, and as a scholar to a scholar, and I have to add Judy to this, or Ms. Gresham to this as well, because when she and I connected, we connected on working with the hands.
Okay.
And I had not met anybody up to that point who could have a dialogue about working with the hands, who could finish my sentence about the fact that that is the true book if you want to know who Tuskegee is.
Right.
Up from slavery.
Right.
And it's the same with you. And it's not this, let me prove my level of knowledge because I think I know something. That's not the piece. As scholars, you're like, I'm trying to find out what I haven't found.
Right.
What is some new stuff that I have not come across because I'm actually really, really hungry to know as much as I can about this topic.
Right.
And that was the case with you. There were two things that you pointed out that stuck out in my mind. One was the story of the Negro. And the reason why Parks had a major issue with Booker T. Washington and the writing of it, because Booker T. Washington is like, listen, I know Black folk aren't the ones that are at the bottom.
Right.
Right. Who's the lowest man down?
Right.
Not the story of the Negro, but the
man farthest down.
Down. That is there because I need to find out who really is the furthest man down. Is it us or is it somebody else? And let me go over to Europe.
Right.
And that's huge. And the other piece, and this was something that Ms. Gresham and I spoke about, which was that that consciousness. That statement is a powerful statement of the arriving at, and I think this is any of us who do work in any space, that your heart is pure, but you don't have a full appreciation of all the politics and all the forces that are at work as you do your work. And as you become conscious of those forces, you get to change course because you realize that you're on the wrong path.
Right.
And those two things helped me understand your scholarship around Booker T. Washington, just as Ms. Gresham, when I spoke to her and she told me her thoughts on working with the hands, and helped me appreciate her scholarship around Washington as well.
Right.
I'm just honored that I'm honored that Tuskegee could provide a platform for you to speak our truth about.
Thank you. I'm appreciative as well. Thank you.
And Ms. Gresham, thank you for the connection again. And to Dr. Washington, I know he's not here, but I have to pay homage to the fact that just the sheer fact that he joined and graced us with an hour of his knowledge.
Yes.
Said it so well the last class, that the work that you've done makes his family, brings honor to his family.
Thank you.
That this work is just that huge, and we know that there aren't many out there doing it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close, but I just want to again just humbly thank you both for all of this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And all the students as well, because they're going to pass all of this on. And I do want to just say one thing. One of the things I always forget to tell people, and I never should forget it, but because it's just a part of me. So I assume one knows, but it's usually the last thing I say that I'm an alumni, because I was kind of put on the path to do the work. And then, of course, I had exceptional insight, but I wouldn't have been able to do this work without, people like Dr. Frank Tolan, because it is a challenge. It is a pushback against 100 years of history. So at times it becomes a very heavy thing, right? Because you're going against the dominant notion and trend, and you have at least 100 years of history that precedes you that you are attempting to challenge and undo. If you go onto the website, because there's a website for the book, I'm sure both of you have seen it, where you can order the book and everything, but I talk about it as a paradigm shift. And of course, you professionally and otherwise, the great thing about it is that, you just take on the task. Initially, of course, you feel the pushback, but the information, the research, and what Washington left us, his own words, is enough, which is part of the reason why I actually broke with a lot of scholarly methods. And there's times where I'm actually, I block quote just so that you get that no one else but Washington is saying this. This is coming from him. I'm not making up. And then, of course, as the historian, I do the interpretive work of the words, but I give his direct words and correspondence as much as possible between Du Bois and him, Garvey and him, Henry Sylvester Williams and him, everybody, all, that's there. And so he was a brilliant man, an unusual spirit to have been born in bondage, something we would never understand. And so personally, I'm actually the vehicle that wrote this particular book to show that there was a global scope to what he had to offer and what he had to offer through Tuskegee. But to be quite frank with you, the work of the historian could also be like a sacred mission, in the sense that until it's done, this will always be an issue. Do you get what I'm saying? So then it's about that person in that moment in time answering that call, so to speak, meaning that, being misunderstood is something maybe that could be a little restless to the living.
Yes.
I don't know if it is to the ancestors or those who have passed on. However, I think that this is the first, and I could write more, trust me, but this is the first shift in the overall record. Do you get what I'm saying? Because in order for Du Bois to be glorified, Washington had to be vilified, and people started to have an interest in this. This is why it is very provocative. The book has been very, very provocative. And so my point is saying that I was well prepared, because the people who taught me pulled me all the way through it. There were moments where I had great difficulty, not with the work, but with pushing back the attitudes and the misunderstanding that is attached to Washington as a result. I do want you to know that Ms. Grisham, I know you know that in the introduction of the book, I talk about how Lewis Harlan openly talked about how he hated Booker T. Washington. So you have to understand that the person who wrote two biographies on Washington and edited all his personal papers hated him and wrote and talked about hating him. So, but was allowed to have a monopoly. And this is a white American male who even talked who wrote about in his own context having racist sentiment of his own. So it was a travesty. So I was obliged to do it. I didn't do it alone. People like Professor Tolan all the way up until 6 months before his death, was pushing me on and on and on, even well after he could not see. He was no longer, he was blind. He was legally blind. And he had read my thesis, and he had read portions of what will be my dissertation. And he continued to tell me, keep going, because very often it would get very interesting. I had people who had a lot of feelings about keeping Washington viewed in a specific light. Okay. But the evidence speaks for itself, you know, and I think that until someone came there and did the work, it would be something that was undone, or, you know, unsettled at least, you know. So
I completely agree, and I think it's similar to what I found with doing this class. There are a lot of questions that I had, because you know what you hear. I mean, a whole speech, the Atlanta Exposition speech, gets turned into the Atlanta Compromise, and unless you do some real research, you don't realize that that's not even the name. It's not the Atlanta Compromise, you know.
no.
And it's actually not the Atlanta Exposition speech. It's another name. It escapes me right now.
The
but
Cotton States Exposition.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, these are real things, and I want to just add this as we close and talking about that. The thing that I realized, and I was sharing this with Ms. Gresham yesterday, Dr. Washington, when he delivered that speech, he wasn't this person just getting up to talk. He was bringing his 40 industries and had them on display at the Negro exhibit across the way. And so he was coming to all of the industrialists in the country, in the world. I mean, these are global leaders. He's coming to them on this world stage and saying, not only am I an educator, not only am I proving what you said is impossible, but I'm also bringing my product to the global stage and telling you we're open for business.
Right.
That is a huge statement.
Yes.
And so when you hear, it's really all the arms for the work that we're doing, but he's also acknowledging that we are here to contribute. We have something to say. And when we say cast down your bucket where you are, we're telling you we cast it down already. You need to come to see us rather than going overseas to see somebody else.
Right.
And you know, that is something that is, I mean, those are the conversations that have to be brought to the forefront, because as I've realized, and when you know the stained glass windows, and there's the piece where some may recognize that as Baby Jesus and others recognize that as Booker T. Washington, it is really that powerful.
Yes.
To see that this man was that much of a contribution.
Yes.
When you go in the chapel under the in the MLK room, where you have the mural that's the creation mural, and it's really all points lead to Tuskegee. That's not this figment in us just like building ourselves up. No, all points lead to Tuskegee.
Yes.
So
it was a hub.
Yes.
It was a hub. Yes.
Yes.
A
And
center.
so, yes. And so the work that you're doing, the work that we're doing, you know, this is the work that needs to happen for us to really get out there. So I'm going to leave it. I'm going to let Ms. Grisham have the last words, and she's the one who made the connection with all of us.
Oh my God, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
You must have been reading my mind, and this is just all too, oh my goodness, so telepathic, because I was just going to try to blurt in, Professor Kwesi, I brought all of you all together. You must let me say these final words. And you just said, but listen, and thank you so much, because what just hit me is the fact that I would be remiss. My father who graduated from Tuskegee, is a well-known high school, well, he's passed away, but he's a well-known high school teacher named Julius R. Gresham. They call
Wow.
him affectionately Daddy G. He was a history major
Oh, wow.
and had his master's, excuse me, had his master's from Tuskegee, was as I said, taught in secondary, taught all American history, world history. But what I had to say is Dr. Tolan was his teacher.
Wow.
He's a student of Dr. Tolan. And as well, I had Professor Fluker my freshman year, and I know Dr. Tolan when I came on campus for those one particular day. Divinely, the Spirit just guides us continuously. I
Yes.
pulled into the John Andrew Hospital driveway where the history classes were taught about 10 or 15 years ago. And who was in the parking lot packing his bags up but Dr. Tolan. And as I got out and gave him a hug, he says, I said, do you recognize me? Because I knew he was up in age. He says, yeah, Judy, I know who you are. And so, we all grew up with his children. But also, as I left and rode around the corner, the curve of the parking lot, there was Professor Fluker.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to tell you, I had to mention my father, because a lot of people in the Tuskegee community know him as a history teacher and a very, popular teacher that was kind of a character. He taught Tom Joyner and Lionel Richie.
Oh, wow.
And that's it. Thank you so much to both of you. And I'm going to let you guys close it out. Thank you so much for letting me say that.
No.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yes, thank you. So on that, everyone, please stay safe.
Yes.
Continue to stay protected. And let's continue to do this work.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Again. All right. Thank you.
God bless.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.